You know that feeling when you finally get what you've dreamed about for so long, and then reality hits you like a ton of bricks? That's exactly where we find the Israelites right now. 3 days ago, they were slaves in Egypt, their backs bent under the weight of Pharaoh's impossible demands, making bricks without straw, watching their children grow up in chains, wondering if freedom was just a cruel joke, whispered between exhausted workers at night. But then Moses came, this old shepherd who'd run away 40 years earlier, standing before Pharaoh with nothing but a wooden staff and words from a god most of them had almost forgotten. And somehow, impossibly, after 10 devastating plagues that brought the mightiest empire on earth to its knees, Pharaoh let them go just like that. Let them go, can you imagine? 600,000 men, not counting women and children, maybe 2 million people total, walking out of Egypt with their heads held high for the first time in 400 years. The taste of freedom, so sweet, it almost hurt Moses himself, could barely believe it as he led them through the streets of Egypt that night, past the houses where every firstborn son lay dead, past the Egyptians who thrust gold and silver into their hands just to make them leave faster, past the life he'd known for 80 years. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his staff, not from age, but from the weight of what God had called him to do: lead these people, these millions of people, to a land flowing with milk and honey. He remembered how much he'd argued with God at that burning bush. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? What if they don't believe me? I'm not a good speaker. Every excuse he could think of, because deep down he was terrified of this exact moment. And now here he was, doing it, actually doing it. But freedom, real freedom, isn't just walking away from your chains. Moses knew that even if the people didn't yet, freedom is having somewhere to go, something to become. And that journey was going to test every single one of them in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. Among the crowd walked Miriam, Moses' sister, now an old woman herself, but with fire still burning in her eyes. She'd been there the day she'd hidden her baby brother in a basket among the reeds, watched as Pharaoh's daughter pulled him from the Nile, seen God's hand protecting him even then. She carried a tambourine now. Couldn't say exactly why, just felt like they might need it for celebrating, for praising, for remembering that God had done the impossible. Near her walked Aaron, the middle sibling, Moses' spokesman and brother. His voice had spoken God's words to Pharaoh when Moses' tongue felt too heavy. His staff had turned to a serpent, brought plagues, proved God's power. But inside, he wrestled with doubts he dared not speak aloud. What if Pharaoh changed his mind? What if this was all some elaborate trap? What if they were leading 2 million people to their deaths in the desert? The people themselves were a mix of emotions so tangled you couldn't separate them. Joy that they were free, terror about what came next, excitement about the unknown, grief for what they were leaving behind. Because even slavery becomes familiar, even chains can feel like home when you've worn them long enough. Young children skipped alongside their parents, too young to understand slavery, too innocent to fear freedom, just excited about this great adventure, sleeping under stars, walking to a new land their parents spoke of in hushed, reverent tones. But the adults, they felt the weight of every step. Every mile away from Egypt was a mile into uncertainty. They had no homes waiting for them, no jobs, no security, just promises from a God who spoke through an old man with a staff, some whispered doubts already. Was life really so bad in Egypt? At least we had food. At least we knew what tomorrow would bring. Human nature is funny that way. We'll complain about our chains right up until someone breaks them. Then suddenly, we miss. Their familiar weight. Moses heard the whispers, felt the doubt like a physical presence, pressing against his chest, but he kept walking, one foot in front of the other, following the pillar of cloud that appeared before them as God's presence. His guidance, his promise that they weren't alone during the day. A massive cloud formation led them, like smoke, but not quite, substantial enough to see clearly, but impossible to explain naturally. It moved when they needed to move, stopped when they needed to rest at night. It became fire, a pillar of flame that gave light and warmth, meant no one could say they couldn't see where God wanted them to go. Equal couldn't claim they'd lost their way in the darkness, but God led them on a strange path, not the direct route to Canaan along the Mediterranean coast that would have taken maybe 2 weeks. Instead, he guided them southeast, toward the wilderness, toward the Red Sea. Moses understood why, even if he didn't speak it aloud yet, the coastal route was heavily fortified. Crawling with Egyptian military outposts and Philistine settlements, these people weren't ready for war, weren't trained as soldiers. Most had never held a weapon. They faced battle now. If they saw armies coming at them, they'd panic, turn back, choose slavery over the risk of death. So God, in his wisdom, took them the long way, the hard way, the way that would forge them into a nations. They walked. Families shared what little food they'd grabbed in their hasty departure. Unleavened bread, because there'd been no time to let it rise. Dried fruit, whatever the Egyptians had pressed into their hands. Elderly man named Caleb, not to be confused with the younger spy who'd come later, sat heavily on a rock during one rest, his grandson beside him, the boy maybe 7 years old, with wide, curious eyes. "Grandfather, where are we going?" the child asked. Caleb's weathered face creased into a smile. "Somewhere better, little one, somewhere our backs will be straight and our children will be free." "But I am free now," the boy said, with the simple logic of childhood. "Yes," Caleb agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, you are, and that's something I never thought I'd live to see." Nearby, a young mother nursed her infant, her third child, but the firstborn in freedom. She looked down at that tiny face and wept, not from sadness, but from overwhelming hope, mixed with crushing fear. What kind of world had she brought this child into? Would they survive the desert? Would they reach this promised land? Her husband stood guard over them. His name was Shemuel, a brickmaker whose hands were scarred and calloused from years of labor. Now those same hands held a walking stick instead of a mold, carried his daughter on his shoulders instead of clay, and he felt simultaneously more free and more terrified than ever before. "We're going to make it," he whispered, trying to convince himself as much as comfort his wife. "God didn't bring us out here to let us die." But even as he spoke, a rumor rippled through the camp like wind through wheat. Someone had seen dust on the horizon behind them, back toward Egypt. Lots of dust, the kind that comes from many horses. Many chariots, many soldiers. At first people dismissed it. Pharaoh had let them go. It was over. But the rumor persisted, grew, morphed into certainty. By the time it reached Moses, the people were already beginning to panic. He climbed a small hill and looked back, his old eyes still sharp. And there, unmistakable in the afternoon sun, a massive cloud of dust rose from the desert behind them. Growing closer by the hour, Pharaoh had changed his mind. The sound reached them before they could see details, a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The thunder of 600 chariots, the best of Egypt's military might, bearing down on 2 million unarmed refugees, Moses felt his stomach drop, not from fear for himself. He'd made peace with death 40 years ago in the desert, but for these people, these families, these children, who'd done nothing wrong except dare to hope for freedom, Aaron rushed to his side, his face pale. "Brother, what do we do?" Before Moses could answer, the people surrounded them, their earlier whispers of doubt exploding into outright panic and rage. "Why did you bring us out here to die?" someone shouted, a man named Dathan, whose voice always seemed to rise above others in complaint. "Were there not enough graves in Egypt? Did you have to bring us to the wilderness to kill us?" Others joined in, the crowd's fear fermenting into anger. Anger at Moses, anger at God, anger at themselves for believing freedom was possible. "We told you to leave us alone," a woman cried, her voice breaking. "We said, let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better to serve them than to die in the desert." Moses felt each word like a physical blow, not because they weren't expected. He'd known this moment would come, but because part of him, a small traitorous part, wondered if they were right. What if he'd misheard God? What if his burning bush encounter had been sunstroke and delusion? What if he'd led 2 million people to their deaths because of an old man's pride? But then, as the doubts threatened to overwhelm him, he felt it, that same presence he'd experienced at the burning bush, in Pharaoh's court, every time he'd raised his staff and watched the impossible become real. God was here. God was present. God had not brought them this far to abandon them now. Moses raised his staff and his voice, not shouting, but speaking with an authority that came from somewhere beyond himself. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." His words seemed to create a pocket of calm in the storm of panic. Not because they made logical sense. Standing still while an army bore down on you was the opposite of logical, but because something in his voice, in his presence, reminded them of the plagues, the miracles, the pillar of cloud and fire still. Fear is a powerful thing. It doesn't release its grip just because someone tells you not to worry. Miriam pushed through the crowd to stand beside her brothers, her old face set with determination. "Listen to him," she called out, her voice still strong, despite her years. "Have you forgotten already? Have you forgotten the Nile turning to blood? The frogs? The locusts? The darkness? Have you forgotten the angel of death passing over our homes while Egypt mourned? The God who did all that, he's still with us." Some nodded, wanting to believe, needing to believe, but others only saw the approaching army, only heard the thunder of hooves and wheels. Moses turned away from the crowd and climbed higher, away from their fear and doubt, to a place where he could be alone with God. "What do I do?" he prayed, not eloquently, not with fancy words, just raw, honest desperation. "I trust you, I believe you, but I don't know what to do. These people are looking to me, and I have nothing to give them except your promises." And God spoke, not audibly, not with a voice everyone could hear, but in that quiet, certain way that left no room for doubt. "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move forward. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." Moses almost laughed, the kind of laugh that comes when what you're hearing is so impossible that humor is the only response left. Divide the sea, the entire Red Sea, create a path through water for 2 million people. But then, hadn't he already seen the impossible? Hadn't his staff already turned to a serpent, called down plagues, struck rocks to bring forth water? Wasn't the pillar of cloud and fire hovering over the camp even now? When you've seen the impossible enough times, it stops being impossible. It just becomes what God does. He descended from his prayer spot with his face set like flint, found Aaron and Miriam, gave them quick instructions. Tell the people to break camp. We're moving forward, toward the sea. Aaron stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Moses, the sea is right there. We're trapped between the water and Pharaoh's army. Moving forward means walking into the sea. I know. Moses said simply, that's exactly what we're going to do. As the words spread through the camp, confusion replaced panic. At least, panic made sense. This was just madness. But something in Moses' certainty, in the way he stood straighter, moved with purpose. So, made people start packing their belongings despite their doubts behind them. The Egyptian army drew closer, close enough now to see individual chariots, to recognize the gleaming bronze armor, to know without question that these were trained killers coming for blood. Pharaoh himself led them. His heart hardened once again, his pride wounded beyond bearing by what Moses and his God had done to Egypt. He'd let them go in his grief and fear. But now that grief had transformed into rage, how dare these slaves humiliate him? How dare their God make a mockery of Egypt's power? How dare they leave and take Egypt's wealth with them? His chariot driver glanced at him nervously. The man had been there through all 10 plagues, had seen things that defied explanation, had nightmares about rivers of blood and darkness that could be felt. My lord, he ventured carefully. Their God is powerful. Perhaps we should— Silence, Pharaoh snapped. Their God has no power here. This is the desert, my territory. They're trapped against the sea. Like animals, we'll show them the price of defying Egypt. But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him, a small voice asking, what if? What if this God who destroyed his nation decided to act again? He pushed the thought away, focused on revenge, on recapturing his slaves, on restoring his pride. The distance closed. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile, the Israelites reached the shore of the Red Sea and stopped, not because Moses told them to, but because there was nowhere else to go. The water stretched before them, vast and impossible, deep enough to swallow them all without a trace behind them. The army was so close they could hear Egyptian commanders shouting orders, hear the creak of leather and wood, hear the anticipation in voices that knew victory was at hand. Children cried, mothers clutched their babies, fathers stood helpless, old people sat down in exhaustion and resignation. This was it. This was the end. But Moses walked to the water's edge, raised his staff high over his head, his old arms steady, despite the weight of the moment, and he prayed, not with fear, not with doubt, but with absolute certainty in the God who'd called him, the God who'd never failed him yet. The pillar of cloud that had been leading them suddenly moved, lifted from the front of the camp and repositioned itself behind them, between Israel and Egypt, bringing darkness to the Egyptians. While giving light to Israel, Pharaoh's army pulled up short, confused by the sudden supernatural darkness, unable to advance, forced to wait until this new plague or trick or whatever it was passed. And as they waited, as 2 million Israelites held their breath, as Moses stood with his staff raised to heaven, the wind began to blow. At first it was just a breeze, the kind that might come up naturally at evening, but within minutes it strengthened, grew, became something no one had experienced before, An east wind, powerful, relentless, divine. Moses stood unmoved at the water's edge, his staff still raised, his eyes closed in prayer or concentration, or both, and the wind howled around him like it was obeying his commander. Rather, obeying the one whose command Moses followed. The people felt it tear at their clothes, whip their hair, force them to shield their eyes. Some tried to set up tents for shelter, but the wind was too strong, knocked down anything they erected. "What's happening?" young children asked their parents, who had no answers. What was happening was beyond natural explanation, beyond human understanding. The wind wasn't random, wasn't chaotic. It was purposeful, directed, focused entirely on the Red Sea. The water began to respond, to move, to behave in ways water shouldn't behave, instead of waves crashing against the shore. The sea began to pull back, to divide, to split down the middle, as if an invisible knife was cutting it in two. People gasped, pointed, some fell to their knees, others stood frozen in disbelief. Aaron stood beside his brother, watching the impossible unfold, feeling his own doubts wash away, like the retreating water. God was real. God was here. God was doing this. Miriam felt tears stream down her weathered face. She'd lived 80 years for this moment, to see her people delivered, to witness God's power displayed so magnificently that no one could ever doubt, ever forget. The wind blew all night, hour after hour, and as it blew, the sea continued to divide, to split wider and wider, revealing something no one expected: dry ground, not mud, not marshland, not waterlogged sand that would trap them, actual dry ground, firm enough to walk on, solid enough to support 2 million people. The sea floor appeared like a path through the middle of the water, and on either side, like walls, like glass, like the most beautiful and terrifying thing any of them had ever seen. The water just stood there, held back by nothing visible, defying gravity and nature, and everything anyone understood about how the world worked. Some of the water droplets at the top caught the moonlight, sparkled like diamonds, created rainbows in the mist, made the whole scene feel like a dream, like they'd stumbled into some other realm where the normal rules didn't apply. As dawn approached, the path through the sea was complete, stretching from shore to shore, maybe a quarter-mile wide, maybe more, with walls of water on both sides. Standing taller than the tallest building any of them had seen, Moses lowered his staff, his arm, finally showing the strain of being raised all night, and turned to face the people. His eyes were bright despite his exhaustion, his face radiant with the reflected glory of what God had done. "This is the way," he said simply. "God has made a path. Now we must walk it." But no one moved. Would you? Would you step onto the seafloor with millions of tons of water held back by nothing but God's will? Would you trust that the water would keep standing? Would you walk between those walls, knowing one misstep, one moment of God's attention elsewhere, and you'd be crushed in an instant? Fear is funny that way. We say we want miracles. We beg for signs. But when God splits the sea right in front of us, we're still too scared to walk through it. Moses understood. He'd been there at the burning bush, terrified to take off his shoes, scared to accept the call. But God had been patient with him then, and he'd be patient now. Miriam broke the silence. This old woman who'd lived through so much, suffered so much, believed so much. She stepped forward, her tambourine in hand, and put one foot on the seafloor between the walls of water. The ground held, the water stayed back. She was fine. She looked back at the crowd and smiled. "Come on, Do you really think God would save us from Egypt just to drown us here?" Her faith, her courage, her simple trust broke the spell one by one. Then, in groups, then, in a massive wave of humanity, people began to descend to the seafloor. Parents carried children, young people supported the elderly, everyone helping everyone else, because in that moment, all their differences, all their complaints, all their fears melted away in the face of what God was doing. A little girl named Dinah walked between her parents, her small hand gripping her father's tightly, her eyes wide as she stared at the walls of water. "Father, look, I can see fish," she said with the wonder only children possess. And she was right. In the walls of water, they could see marine life suspended, fish and plants and things that lived in the deep, all frozen in place. Watching these humans walk through what should have been their home, some people reached out to touch the walls, felt the cool moisture on their fingertips, but the water didn't collapse, didn't break, stayed firm. Like God's hand was personally holding every drop in place. The journey through the sea took hours. 2 million people moving together. The elderly going slow, the young wanting to run but held back by their parents. Everyone processing the sheer impossibility of what they were. Experiencing Moses walked among them, checking on families, encouraging the fearful, always moving forward, always reminding them that God was with them. One mother approached him, her infant in her arms, tears streaming down her face. "My son was born in slavery," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I thought he'd die in slavery. But now he'll tell his children he walked through the Red Sea. He'll tell them God split the water so he could be free." Moses touched the baby's head gently. "He'll tell them more than that. He'll tell them God is faithful, that what he promises, he delivers, that his love for his people knows no limits." As they walked, people began to sing, started as one voice, then spread until thousands were joining in. Songs of praise, of thanks, of wonder. Their voices echoing off the walls of water in a way that made it sound like heaven itself was joining the chorus. Young men started dancing, couldn't help themselves. The joy was too much to contain, spinning and leaping on the sea floor, while their friends laughed and joined in, even some of the doubters, the complainers, the ones who'd been ready to stone Moses hours earlier. Even they felt it, this overwhelming sense that they were part of something bigger than themselves, witnesses to a moment that would be told and retold for thousands of years. Halfway through, Moses paused and looked back. The pillar of cloud darkness still separated them from the Egyptian army. He couldn't see Pharaoh's forces, but he knew they were there, waiting, watching, probably arguing about whether to follow. Part of him, a small part he wasn't proud of, hoped they'd turn back, choose to live, rather than chase after a God who'd already proven his power 10 times over. But he knew better, knew pride, knew how it could drive men to destruction, even when every rational thought screamed retreat. As the last of the Israelites stepped onto the seafloor and began their crossing, as the sun rose fully and illuminated the miracle in brilliant morning light, the pillar of cloud began to lift. When the darkness finally lifted, when Pharaoh and his army could finally see what lay before them, there was a long moment of absolute silence. The Red Sea was split, divided, opened like a scroll, with a path of dry ground running through the middle, and 2 million Israelites more than halfway across. Some of the Egyptian soldiers made sounds of fear, the kind that come from deep in your throat when your mind can't process what your eyes are seeing. "Sir," one of the commanders said carefully, his voice shaking slightly, Perhaps we should reconsider. Their God has... No, Pharaoh cut him off. But even he felt the fear, saw the impossibility, knew in his soul that this was beyond any magic or trick his priests could explain. But pride is a beast that doesn't die easily, especially when it's been wounded as deeply as his had been. He'd lost his son, his firstborn in the 10th plague, had held that cold body and wept, like he never knew he could weep, and the pain of that loss had temporarily broken him, made him let the slaves go. But pain transforms, becomes anger, becomes rage, becomes a need for revenge so strong it overrides common sense. He looked at the path through the sea and made a calculation. Those walls of water were being held by their God. Fine, but their God would have to choose. Keep holding the water or use his power to fight off 600 chariots. Either way, Pharaoh would have his revenge. Forward, he commanded, his voice hard as stone. These slaves will learn what it means to defy Egypt. Some of his soldiers obeyed immediately, trained to follow orders without question. But others hesitated, looked at each other with expressions that asked if their king had lost his mind. The chariot driver beside Pharaoh, the same one who'd questioned him earlier, Alice leaned close and whispered urgently, "My lord, this is madness. We've seen what their God can do. We should turn back while we still can." Pharaoh struck him, not hard but enough to make his point. "Drive, or I'll find someone who will..." The man swallowed, gripped the reins tighter, and urged the horses forward. One chariot, moving, became 10, 10 became 100, 100 became 600, the entire army, descending to the seafloor in pursuit of the fleeing slaves. The horses were terrified. You could see it in their eyes, in the way they fought the reins. Animals have instincts. Humans override with their pride. And they knew this was wrong, knew they were entering a place they shouldn't be. But the drivers forced them on, whips cracking, voices shouting, and slowly the entire Egyptian army moved between the walls of water. It was different from when the Israelites had crossed. The Egyptians felt it immediately, a sense of dread, of wrongness, like the very air was thick with divine displeasure. The walls of water seemed darker from this perspective, more menacing, and in the depths, some soldiers swore they could see shapes, things moving, watching them with ancient, patient malice. "Keep moving," commanders shouted, trying to maintain order, trying to keep the formation tight. But fear is contagious, and it was spreading through the ranks like wildfire. Partway through, the chariots began to have problems. Wheels started coming off, not all at once, but one here, another there, axles breaking, wood splintering. Things that shouldn't happen to well-maintained military equipment suddenly happening everywhere at once. A wheel fell off Pharaoh's own chariot, nearly threw him from the platform. His driver fought to control the horses as the vehicle lurched and scraped along the sea floor. "What's happening?" Pharaoh shouted, looking around to see chaos spreading through his army. Chariots stopping, colliding, soldiers jumping clear to avoid being crushed. One of his generals pulled up beside him on foot, his face pale. "My lord, we need to turn back. The Lord is fighting for them. We can't win this." And in that moment, with water towering on both sides, with his army falling apart around him, with the impossible made manifest before his eyes, Pharaoh finally understood. This wasn't a battle he could win, wasn't even a battle. It was an execution. The God who'd destroyed Egypt with plagues, who'd split the sea, who'd led his people with cloud and fire, that God had been patient, had given warning after warning, had shown mercy by letting them live after everything they'd done. But Pharaoh had ignored it all, had let pride override wisdom, had chosen revenge over survival. And now, trapped between walls of water with nowhere to run, he finally felt fear, real fear, the kind that makes your bones turn to water and your courage evaporate. "Turn back," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Everyone turn back now." But turning 600 chariots in a narrow space with damaged equipment and terrified horses and walls of water on both sides was impossible. They were trapped, caught between the sea and their own pride. On the far shore, the last of the Israelites climbed out of the seafloor onto dry land, safe, delivered, looking back at the Egyptian army stuck in the middle of the path. Moses stood at the water's edge again, his staff in hand, his face grave despite their deliverance. He felt no joy in what was about to happen, no pleasure in the death that was coming. These were still human beings, still created in God's image, still loved by someone, but justice is justice. Mercy has limits, and Egypt had crossed every line that existed. God's voice came again, quiet, certain, final. "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back." Moses stood there for a long moment, his hand trembling, not from age, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He'd killed an Egyptian once, 40 years ago, in anger, in a moment of passion, trying to defend one of his people, had spent 4 decades feeling guilty about that single death. Now he was about to be responsible for thousands. Aaron saw his hesitation, put a hand on his shoulder. "Brother, this is not murder. This is God's judgment. They chose this path." Moses nodded, knowing his brother was right, but still feeling the burden. Then he lifted his staff and stretched out his hand toward the sea. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The walls held. The water stood firm. Then, like a dam breaking, like the universe remembering how physics worked, the sea began to return. It started as a tremor, a shaking in the walls of water. Then, cracks appeared, fissures where the water pressure became too much for even God's restraining hand. Once he released it, the Egyptians saw it happening, saw their death coming in the form of millions of tons of water, and pandemonium erupted. Soldiers abandoned their chariots, ran for shore, either shore, didn't matter which, just anywhere that wasn't about to be underwater. Pharaoh's chariot driver unhitched the horses, screamed at his king to run, but Pharaoh stood frozen, watching his pride, his revenge, his entire world collapse in walls of water. Some of the younger soldiers, the faster ones, almost made it to the edges before the water came down. Almost. The sound was indescribable. Imagine every thunderclap you've ever heard multiplied by 1,000. Imagine an avalanche made of water. Imagine the roar of nature unleashed after being held back by divine will. The walls collapsed inward, met in the middle with a crash that shook the ground, sent spray hundreds of feet into the air, created waves that would have capsized ships if any had been nearby. 2 million Israelites stood on the far shore and watched as the Egyptian army vanished, swallowed by the sea. They dared to enter, erased as if they'd never existed. Some cheered, fists in the air, voices hoarse with triumph, watching their oppressors destroyed after 400 years of slavery. Others wept, hands over mouths, unable to look away, horrified despite everything Egypt had done to them. Children buried their faces in their parents' clothes. The sound alone was traumatic, the sight even more so. Moses lowered his staff slowly, his arm shaking now, his face wet with tears he wasn't ashamed of. "They're gone," Aaron said unnecessarily, his voice hollow. Miriam stepped forward to the water's edge, her tambourine gripped so tight her knuckles were white. Staring at the waves that had already returned to normal, as if the path had never existed, as if 600 chariots and thousands of soldiers weren't at the bottom. The sea was just the sea again, blue and beautiful and deadly. But along the shore, washed up by the returning water, came evidence of what had happened. Pieces of chariots, broken wheels, shattered weapons, armor that would never protect anyone again. And bodies, the sea spit them out like it was offended by what Egypt had tried to do, deposited them on the sand, where the Israelites could see, could count, could know beyond doubt that their enemies were truly gone. A young man named Joshua, who would later become Moses' successor, stood looking at one of the Egyptian soldiers washed ashore. A man, probably around his own age, maybe had a wife, maybe children, now dead because his king's pride couldn't accept defeat. "We were slaves to them," Joshua said, to no one in particular. "They beat us, killed our children, worked us until we dropped, and still part of me feels sick seeing them like this." An older man nearby, scars on his back from Egyptian whips, spat on the ground. "Don't waste your pity. They made their choice, came after us even after God showed them mercy. Some people won't stop until they're stopped permanently." Both men were right in their own way. The hours after were strange, relief and trauma mixing together. People laughing one moment and crying the next. Some dancing, while others sat in numb silence. Parents tried to shield their children from the bodies, from the evidence of mass death. But it was impossible. This was part of their story now, part of what freedom had cost. As the sun rose higher, warming their faces, drying their clothes, still damp from sea spray, the reality began to sink in. They were free, truly free. Egypt couldn't chase them anymore, couldn't drag them back, couldn't reclaim them as property. The chains they'd worn for 400 years weren't just unlocked. They were shattered, destroyed, cast to the bottom of the sea along with the army that had enforced them. Moses sat heavily on a rock, exhausted beyond words, feeling his 80 years in every bone. Miriam approached him, her tambourine now in both hands, her face radiant despite her tears. "Brother," she said softly, "look at them. Look at what God has done." He looked, saw 2 million faces beginning to understand, beginning to believe, beginning to hope. "Come on," Miriam said suddenly, her voice stronger. "Are we going to stand here silent after what we just witnessed?" She raised her tambourine and struck it, the sharp, bright sound cutting through the heavy atmosphere. Then she began to sing. Her voice was old, but strong, carrying across the shore, and the words she sang would be remembered and repeated for thousands of years. "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." At first, she sang alone. This old woman who'd spent her life believing God would deliver her people, who'd hidden her baby brother in a basket and watched God protect him, who'd lived to see every promise fulfilled. Then other women joined her, their voices adding harmony, their own tambourines and instruments joining the music. Then men added deeper tones, children high notes, until thousands were singing, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The song spread like fire through the camp, everyone pouring out their fear and relief and joy and trauma and hope into music that seemed to rise to heaven itself. People danced, couldn't help it. The emotion had to come out somehow, and dancing was better than screaming or weeping or collapsing. They danced on the shore, where their enemies' bodies washed up, danced because they were alive, because their children would grow up free, because God had split the sea and made a way where there was no way. The celebration lasted for hours. People needed it, needed to release the terror and tension of the night, needed to feel joy instead of just fear. But eventually, the music slowed. The dancing stopped. The reality of where they were began to set in. They were on the far side of the Red Sea, yes, free from Egypt, yes, but now standing at the edge of a vast wilderness with no clear idea of what came next beyond follow the cloud. The practical concerns that had been drowned out by immediate survival began to surface. What are we going to eat? Someone asked. Where are we going to get water? Another chimed in. How long until we reach this promised land? Moses heard the questions, knew they were valid, knew his answer wouldn't satisfy everyone. God brought us this far, he said simply. He'll provide what we need when we need it. Some nodded, their faith strengthened by witnessing the miracle at the sea. Others looked skeptical. Miracles are impressive, but you can't eat them, and they don't quench thirst. The camp began to organize itself, families finding each other, setting up temporary shelters, taking inventory of what little they'd brought from Egypt. A woman named Elisheva realized she'd lost her cooking pot in the chaos of the crossing, sat down and wept, not just for the pot, but for everything, the fear, the stress, the impossibility of making a life in this barren place. Her neighbor tried to comfort her, offered to share, and that small act of kindness started a ripple effect, people sharing food, sharing tools, sharing hope. Because if they'd learned anything from the Red Sea, it was that impossible wasn't really impossible when God was involved. Joshua walked among the men, noting who was strong, who had military bearing, who could be trained to fight if needed, because the promised land wasn't empty, it was occupied, and eventually they'd need an army. Caleb, the old man with the grandson, sat, teaching the boy about what had happened, making sure the child understood. This wasn't just a story, but actual history, actual divine intervention. When you have children, you tell them about this day, Caleb said seriously. You tell them about the God who split the sea. The boy nodded solemnly, trying to comprehend the weight of what he'd witnessed, knowing someday this would be the defining story of his people. As afternoon stretched into evening, the pillar of cloud that had been hovering over the sea moved inland, signaling it was time to continue the journey. The people groaned, still exhausted from the crossing, from the fear, from the emotional whiplash of the last 24 hours. But they began packing up. Moses led them into the wilderness, following the cloud, one step at a time. The desert was harsh, rocky, hot during the day and cold at night. Nothing like the fertile Nile Delta they'd left behind. Some of the complaints started immediately. At least in Egypt we had shade, someone muttered. At least in Egypt we had regular meals, another agreed. Moses ignored them. He'd expected this, knew human nature well enough to understand that fear makes people irrational, makes them romanticize even their slavery. 3 days they walked into the desert, 3 days without finding water. The little they'd brought from the sea was running out. Children cried from thirst. The elderly struggled. Even the strong ones began to feel the effects of dehydration. Then finally, they came to an oasis, a place called Mara, and everyone rushed toward the water. But the first ones to taste it spat it out immediately. It's bitter, poisonous. We can't drink this. The complaint rippled through the crowd, swelled into angry accusations directed at Moses. You brought us out here to die of thirst. We should have stayed in Egypt. Moses felt the familiar weight of leadership, the burden of 2 million lives depending on him when he had nothing to give them. He prayed, simply, desperately, what do I do? God showed him a piece of wood, told him to throw it into the water, and when he did, the water became sweet, drinkable, life-giving. The people drank deeply, their complaints forgotten in their relief, at least for the moment. And God spoke to them all, his voice somehow audible to everyone, a rumble like distant thunder that made the words unmistakable. If you will listen carefully to the Lord your God, and do what is right in his eyes. If you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. It was a covenant, a promise with conditions, freedom with responsibility. Some heard and understood, committed themselves to following God's ways. Others just heard more rules and inwardly groaned. From Mara, they traveled to Elim, a beautiful oasis with 12 springs and 70 palm trees, enough water and shade for everyone. Here they rested for a while, recovered from their ordeal. Let the trauma of the Red Sea begin to heal. Joshua used the time to start organizing the men. Not formally, not obviously, just noting who had leadership qualities, who stayed calm in crisis, who others naturally followed. Aaron spent time with the elders, listening to their concerns, mediating disputes, learning the complicated work of governing a nation instead of just being slaves, told what to do. Miriam gathered the women, taught them songs, helped them process what they'd experienced, created community in the midst of chaos. Moses walked the camp, checked on families, blessed children, answered endless questions about where they were going and when they'd arrive. An elderly woman stopped him, grabbed his robe with surprising strength. "I won't live to see the promised land, will I?" He looked at her aged face, saw the years of slavery written in every line, knew she was probably right, but couldn't bear to say it. "You'll see your children enter it," he said instead. "Your grandchildren. Isn't that enough?" She smiled, toothless but radiant. Yes, that's more than enough. I was born a slave, but I'll die free. That's everything." Simple faith like that sustained Moses when his own doubts crept in. But Elim couldn't last forever. The cloud moved, and they had to follow, back into the wilderness, back into the harsh reality of survival. The next stretch was brutal. The desert of sin, weeks of walking with food supplies, dwindling, water rationed carefully, everyone hungry and tired and starting to wonder if freedom was worth this price. The complaints grew louder, more bitter, more frequent. "We should go back to Egypt" became a common refrain, as if that was even possible, as if Pharaoh's army wasn't at the bottom of the Red Sea. Dathan, the same man who'd complained at the shore, became a ringleader of the descent, constantly stirring up trouble, questioning Moses' leadership, suggesting they choose a new leader who'd take them back. Moses felt the weight crushing him, not from God, but from the people, their needs, their doubts, their constant demands. One night he sat alone outside the camp, stared at the stars, and asked God honestly, "Why me? What made you think I could do this? I'm just an old shepherd who can barely speak clearly." And God, patient as always, reminded him, "I don't need you to be anything except willing. The power is mine. The plan is mine. Your job is just to obey." Simple, clear, still impossibly hard. As food ran out completely, as people began to truly starve, the complaints reached a fever pitch. "We were better off in Egypt. At least there we had meat and bread. Now we're going to die in this desert." Their selective memory was astounding. They'd forgotten the whips, the dead children, the hopelessness. All they remembered was having full stomachs. But God heard their complaints, and instead of being angry, he showed mercy. He promised bread from heaven, quail in the evening, manna in the morning, enough food for everyone every day. And he delivered. That very evening, quail covered the camp, easy to catch, enough to feed millions. The next morning, the ground was covered with small round things like frost, white, sweet, unlike anything anyone had ever tasted. "What is it?" people asked each other in Hebrew. "Manhu," which became its name, manna. God gave them instructions. Gather only what you need for one day. Don't try to hoard it. Trust that tomorrow there will be more. Some obeyed, some didn't. Those who hoarded woke to find their extra manna rotting with worms. A clear message that trust meant daily dependence. On the sixth day, they were to gather double, because the seventh day was to be a Sabbath, a day of rest, holy to the Lord. This became their routine, their rhythm: 6 days of gathering, 1 day of rest, manna every morning, following the cloud whenever it moved. Months passed, then a year, and the journey continued. Years later, when the wandering was done, when the promised land was finally entered by the next generation, when Moses himself had seen it from a distance, but not entered, when Joshua led the conquest and Caleb finally got his inheritance, the story of the Red Sea remained. Parents told it to their children, who told it to their children, who told it to theirs. The story of impossibility made possible, of slavery transformed into freedom, of God making a way where there was no way. In every generation, when things looked darkest, when enemies surrounded them, when hope seemed foolish, someone would remember. Remember the Red Sea, they'd say. Remember when God split the water, and remembering, they'd find courage to face their own impossible situations. Because the miracle at the Red Sea wasn't just about escaping Egypt, wasn't just about 2 million refugees crossing on dry ground. It was about God's character, His faithfulness, His power, His love for His people. It was about how He sees the oppressed and hears their cries and acts on their behalf even when they've forgotten Him. It was about how He fights for those who can't fight for themselves. The elderly man telling the story to his grandchildren around the campfire that night, in the Promised Land, finished with the same words Miriam had sung on the far shore. Sing to the Lord, for He has triumphed gloriously. And the children, eyes wide with wonder, asked the question children always ask when hearing this story. Did it really happen? Did the water really stand up like walls? The old man smiled, touched the scar on his foot from a rock in the sea floor, met each child's eyes. I was there, he said simply. I walked through, I saw the water standing, I heard the Egyptian chariots, I felt the spray when the sea came crashing down. He paused. Let the weight of eyewitness testimony sink in. It happened, all of it, and I'll tell you why it matters. The children leaned closer, because the God who did that then is the same God who's with us now. He doesn't change, doesn't forget His promises, doesn't abandon His people. When you face your own Red Sea, your own impossible situation, your own enemies bearing down while water blocks your path, you remember this story. You remember that God makes ways where there are no ways. You remember that what looks like the end is often just the setup for a miracle. You remember that the same power that split the sea is available to you. One of the children, a little girl with her grandmother's eyes, asked softly, "But what if I'm scared? What if I don't have enough faith?" The old man thought of Moses at the burning bush, arguing with God, making excuses, terrified of the call. He thought of the people at the shore, complaining, panicking, ready to stone their leader. He thought of his own doubts, his own fears, his own moments of wanting to turn back. Being scared doesn't mean you don't have faith, he said gently. Faith isn't the absence of fear. It's taking the next step even when you're terrified. Moses was scared. We were all scared, but we walked through anyway because God said to. That's all faith really is. Trusting God enough to take the next step. And then the next, and then the next, until you look back and realize you've walked through the sea. The children nodded, processing, wondering what Red Seas they'd face in their own lives. The fire crackled, sparks rising into the night sky where they mixed with stars. And somewhere out there, in another generation, in another century, in another millennium, this same story would be told. Not because it was easy to believe, Not because it made logical sense, not because splitting seas is a normal occurrence, but because it happened, because it changed everything, because it revealed a God who loves his people enough to do the impossible for them. The story of Moses and the Red Sea doesn't really end, can't end, because it's not just history. It's theology, it's identity, it's hope. It's the reminder that we serve a God of miracles, a God who sees, who hears, who acts, a God who splits seas. The old man stood slowly, his aged joints protesting, but his heart as full as it had been that day on the far shore when Miriam struck her tambourine and everyone danced. "Come on," he said to the children. "It's late. Time for sleep." They groaned, but obeyed, heading toward their tents. One boy lingered, looked back at his grandfather. "Tell it again tomorrow? The whole story?" The old man smiled. "Yes, tomorrow and the day after, and every day you want to hear it, because some stories are too important to forget." As the children disappeared into the darkness, as the camp settled into sleep, as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, the old man stood alone by the dying fire. He'd walked through the Red Sea 70 years ago, felt the spray, seen the walls, heard the thunder of collapsing water. And in all the years since, through every trial, every battle, every moment of doubt, he'd never forgotten that God makes ways where there are no ways. That impossible isn't really impossible when God is involved. That the same power that split the sea is still active, still present, still willing to do the impossible for those who trust him. He lifted his hands to the sky, whispered a prayer of thanks. And somewhere, in the eternal now where all moments exist at once, God smiled. Because faith like that, faith that remembers, faith that tells the story, faith that believes against all odds, that's what he's always been looking for. That's what the Red Sea was really all about.